Welcome to APUS History. As we're starting to look at the development of the 13 English colonies in North America, this is just going to focus for a bit on the Chesapeake region, what becomes Maryland and Virginia mainly, and where Jamestown first starts, where we have the first successful settlement of the English in North America. And particularly, we're going to focus on life and death in the Chesapeake, because that really affects the culture, okay? And communities sometimes focus more on the whole, on everybody, and sometimes they might focus more on individuals. And we want to see how that development really kind of matters. So first off, make sure you know your geography. When we talk about the Chesapeake, we are talking about you know, this region in here, okay? And that's really important to understand where we're talking. It's good to be familiar with where the other colonies are going to eventually develop. It's worth pointing out that Jamestown started in 1607, and the final 13th colony, Georgia, will not be founded until 1732. So there's quite a bit of time in there as well. We want to consider that. That there's going to be changes over time in all of that. Going to look at 5 areas when it comes to life and death in the Chesapeake. The first being, we're going to take a minute to look at relationship between the Indians, particularly the Powhatan tribes, and the English. We're going to examine gender relations, the role of men and women, and we might find that it was different from one English colony to the other, but we're going to focus on it here in the Chesapeake, what will become Virginia mostly. We're going to look at what's called the culture of death, okay, and get an understanding of how, because of the prevalence of death in this region, it had a profound impact on the people of this area. We're also going to look at family life, which is very much, of course, in some ways connected to gender roles. And we want to be aware of family life because that's a key part of the culture. And then we'll look at politics and government a little bit in all of this. So let's just talk about English and Indian relations in the Chesapeake. Now, some of this should be reviewed from some of your other readings and perhaps videos. If you remember, when you learn kind of the story of Jamestown, the paramount chief was Chief Powhatan, which he's also leader of the Powhatan people. And you have to understand he was getting a lot of pressure from other tribes. The people of this area were aware of Europeans. You know, the Spanish have been coming to the Americas for over 100 years, and he had a lot of pressure on him to, you know, make this encounter work for them. And the particular thing that Powhatan and his people wanted was trade, particularly for steel goods, okay? And they are trying to do what they can to get those things. Now, one of the things they have that the English need is food. They had a surplus of corn, and so they are able to trade for those goods. It's worth reviewing from your readings a little bit about the role of Pocahontas. You know, if you watch the movie, it looks like she saved the life of John Smith, but that incident, the Pocahontas incident, as it's called, is a little more complex than that, about some cultural misunderstandings and the fact that she was only about 12 years old and may not have understood what was completely going on, okay? But the English have a rough go at first, and you know, one of their first winters is often called the starving time. But they start to see, after a few years, some economic stability thanks to tobacco and being able to cultivate tobacco and sell it. And the guy that really gets tobacco off the ground is John Rolfe, who will marry Pocahontas. And that brings economic stability to Virginia and to the Chesapeake region. And so that first generation of English people found they had to trade with the Powhatans and have semi-peaceful relationship with them. But as they become more economically stable and need more land, that starts to put pressure on the local tribes, particularly as the English come on and take their hunting grounds. So 1607 in the first few years, great, but by 1622, warfare has erupted, particularly in a war called the Anglo-Powhatan War. So now we start to see resistance from the Powhatans. They kill about, roughly around 200 or 300 English, 347-ish. And in return, the English over the next couple of years kill many times many more Powhatans as a result of that. So it's sometimes good to understand that shift, okay, where you have peace out of necessity, but as time goes by and things get better, it can create more problems. Gender relations. So one of the first things you need to know is that because Jamestown was an economic endeavor, they didn't bring a lot of families. And when you study the Puritans in Plymouth and the Pilgrims, that's different. In fact, men outnumbered women 3 to 1. And that's significant. You have to understand in this English culture of the 1600s, getting married was kind of important for the economic welfare of a woman. And as a result, some people might say that, boy, this could be a golden age. That means 3 suitors for every woman. But marriage, mostly an economic consideration at the time, marriage did not mean necessarily a golden age for women. First off, divorce was extremely difficult to achieve for a woman, almost impossible in this culture, okay? Men owned property within the marriage, okay? So if a woman even inherited property, getting married meant she basically signed that over to her husband. A woman's work was very difficult in this culture, okay? The saying goes, the man, he works from sun to sun, but the woman's work is never done, okay? And women were, and for the most part, on a pretty relentless cycle of childbearing, something like having a child every 24 to 30 months on average. And many women would, die from complications of childbirth, which brings me to kind of the next topic in all of this. And we'll kind of come back to women's role in the family here in a minute. But there's this kind of culture of death. The Chesapeake region had a very high mortality rate. Part of that is that it's a very kind of humid, semi-tropical region, a lot of mosquitoes carrying a lot of diseases. Also, it's a culture of tobacco, and people didn't just sell it, they smoked it a lot. And that created, of course, health problems. Tobacco was so prevalent, it was almost like currency in a sense. You could trade for tobacco for about everything. So the life expectancy for any adult who reached 20 years, and we'll get to those who didn't reach it in a minute, was 45 years old. So I want you to think about that. In Virginia, average life expectancy is 45 years old, okay? Meanwhile, back in England, the average life expectancy was about 55 years old. And once Plymouth gets established, the New England colonies get established, okay? Average life expectancy was 65 years old, and you'll be learning a little bit more as to why that was higher perhaps, okay? So you have a culture where you're used to people dying around you, and that exacerbates or creates kind of a culture of individualism as people are trying to kind of come to grips with that. It's a reality of that. And tied to that culture of mortality is family life. Okay, families in the 1600s, you got to understand the concept of child mortality, okay? Before age 1, okay? Before age 1, about 25% of children did not make it to age 1. Age 18, only about 50% made it to that age. That's why I said earlier of the adults who made it to 20. High rates of child mortality, high rates of what we call orphanhood, children losing both parents or at least a parent. Most children in this culture lost a parent by age 18. So families became a little bit more complex. There was a lot of what we call, mixed families, but not due to divorce, but more so due to death. Okay, there was kind of an affectionate term that some men would refer to their wives as their now wife. Meaning like, she's my wife for now. She might die tomorrow. I might die tomorrow. Okay, so families were very complex, and this also meant that parental control over their children was somewhat limited, because you may not know your parent your whole life. There's a lot of kind of social fluidity in this, and so on. And so we know that a lot of young people didn't listen to their parents a whole lot during this time. We see higher incidence of out-of-wedlock births, which suggests that more young people may be engaged in sexual activity outside of marriage. And so it's a culture that maybe doesn't hold on to those traditions perhaps as much as you might see in some other parts of the colonies. But this exacerbates kind of that culture of individualism as well. Okay. That I don't know if my family's going to be around, and so that sense of community is less so there than we might see in some of the other colonies. Last thing I want to touch upon in the Chesapeake region is the politics. Okay, so just a reminder, people are coming from England, and it's important to remember the system of parliament that they have there, and want to compare that a little bit to the system they will develop in Virginia. Particularly, they will develop a lawmaking body called the House of Burgesses. And I want you to think about how this ties into that culture of individualism. So think of it this way. Back in England in the 17th century, to vote for parliament required what they called a 40-shilling freehold. And what that meant is you had to own land, okay, that generated 40 shillings of tax revenue every year. So if you had enough land and you paid enough taxes on it, you could vote for a member of parliament. What that meant is not a lot of people voted. In fact, only about 10 to 15%, okay, of the adult male population met the requirement. Requirement met, okay? So voting was more of a selection. It wasn't terribly competitive. A lot of times if you quote unquote voted for parliament, there was really nobody running against anybody. Whereas as we get to the late 1600s, late 17th century, and we look at the House of Burgesses, and by the way, the word Burgess means representative, okay? It's kind of tied to the term burg. Okay, I represent my town and my community. So the House of Burgesses was founded around 1619, and election was based on a much more broad electorate, meaning pretty much all adult males could vote. All adult white males, but could vote in there. And so this was a little bit more competitive. You had actually people running for seats in their various regions and so on, which really represents that culture of individualism that I kind of have to look out for myself. And even though I'm representing people, we're doing it more competitively. And so it's really important to think about this. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking at some of the other cultures during this time. And I want you to think about this question, which is why the individual is more important than the community in the 17th century. And you can think about now multiple factors, the fact that you don't know when people are going to die, and you don't, your family is a little more complex a setup than what you might see in New England. But as you look at other regions, and I'm particularly going to ask you when you look at the Puritans, okay, and you look at the Chesapeake and expanding more broadly to Virginia, how does it compare to, say, Massachusetts and the Puritans, where they were very family-based and they were quite a bit more religious? Those are the things you're going to want to look at as you think about this, and think about the impact that might have when these colonies 100 and something years later are starting to break away from Britain with these kind of different cultures. Thanks.